Yes, we are live on Facebook and YouTube.
Okay. Well, shall we begin, or what shall we do?
No, can we wait a little bit? We haven't got very many participants yet.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I would.
We'll wait a little bit. Yeah.
Argue
And
a little bit.
only two panelists so far, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I can put the slide up now.
Thanks.
Yeah. Martin is there.
Okay.
So Debbie, you tell us when you think we should begin.
We will. I will. Yeah. Thanks. Nadeem, while I have the slide on, I'm not. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry. No, it's okay. Attendees, Martin.
Yeah, you are the host now, and you can now make me co-host.
Thank you. I will.
Hello, good evening.
Hello, welcome.
Hello, Shresh.
Welcome.
Hello. Good evening.
Good evening. We can hear you, Shrish, and we can also
Lovely.
see. Yes.
Good evening.
Very sorry, assuring.
Welcome.
So we are about to begin in a minute.
Right. And I'll cover myself adequately for the formal occasion.
Geraldine. Eric. Hasna. Okay, we haven't got Eric or Hasna yet that I can see. Nadeem, if you could see them, could you promote them, please?
No, they aren't there.
No, I can't see them either.
No, okay.
Shall we make a beginning then, Paula? What do you think?
Excuse me? What do I think about starting?
Yeah, we start and they will join when they come.
Okay, I'm not.
Richard, what do you
certain.
think?
I'm not certain why they are not here.
So-
My guess is maybe connection problems, since they are in regions when there are a lot of connection problems.
Yeah. I think we should begin, and we might invite some more people to join you as we go through. So, is that okay, Paolo? We will begin now.
Sure, no
Okay.
problem.
So to everybody, I welcome you back to the Decentring ELT Opportunities and Challenges Conference, which the Hornby Trust is hosting together with INET, Teachers Association of English Teachers in India, and Dr. Ambedkar University in Delhi. And Amal, would you like to take over?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I join Richard in welcoming everyone back to the conference. We had a very fascinating first day yesterday when various teacher associations and their representatives from different parts of the world presented their case studies, illustrating certain practices in which decentering element was quite visible. Today, we are going to start with a panel discussion on understandings around decentering. And I'm happy to welcome Paula Rebelodo, who will be moderating and leading this panel discussion. So welcome, Paula, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome on day 2. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to join you yesterday. I had problems, international problems. I was flying, so I'm sorry that I just missed the discussion, but I was able to listen to the discussion later. What we are planning to do today is to have a discussion about our panelists' own understandings of decentering ELT. So this is going to be a lively discussion. It's not going to be structured in a way of question, answer. It's going to allow just the panelists to openly express their views and perceptions about what decentering ELT means to them. And then after that, we are going to allow for more open discussion from them again, for them to continue expressing their views on the topic based on what other fellow panelists mentioned. And then after that, we are going to allow for some questions from the audience. Amal is going to help us gathering questions through the different channels where we are transmitting this conference. So just for you to know how the panel is going to be structured, okay? So once again, welcome everybody for joining us. Welcome our panelists, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to participate. From our group of panelists, I'm not going to read all their biodata because their records are so interesting that it will take me a long time to mention all their accolades. So I'm just going to briefly mention their name, their country, and what they're currently doing at the moment. If you want to know a little bit more about them, their full biodata is in our program. So first we have Eric with us. Eric is from Cameroon. He is a lecturer at the Higher Teacher Training College in Yaoundé in Cameroon. So thank you very much, Eric, for joining us and for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Paula. I'm happy to be here and glad to see Sri, Prem, Gracia, Amol, Richard, and yourself. I look forward to an exciting discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Eric. And then it's also with us representing Latin America. We have Gracia Mendoza from Honduras. She is an education specialist for the U.S. government and USAID Honduras, supporting public education and working in partnership with the Ministry of Education in Honduras. Thank you very much, Gracia, for joining us.
So happy to be here today, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Gracia. And we also have here with us Shresh. He's from India. He is, when I was reading your biodata, I was like, wow, that's very impressive. He's an examiner trainer, monitor, trainer of trainers. But he, when we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, he said, but I'm mainly a teacher. And right now my role is I am a teacher at a school in India. So thank you very much, Shresh. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Great. Thanks for the chance you gave me. May God bless you all.
Thank you. And then last but not least, we have Prem. Prem is a good friend of ours. Prem is from Nepal. He works at the Chinese University of Hong Kong as an assistant professor of applied linguistics. Thank you very much, Prem, for being with us today.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, everyone.
Okay, so we are going to start, and what we are going to do to begin, I haven't assigned anybody like a time. Oh, Hasna is here. I'm
Yeah.
so happy to see you, Hasna. Hasna has been having problems in connecting. So Hasna is with us today. She's from Palestine, and she works for the Palestinian Ministry of Education as an English teacher. And thank you very much, Hasna, for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And so having almost a full board of panelists, we are going to start our discussion. I'm going to just pose a question, and I'm going to give each of them room to talk about their own understanding. So the question that they're going to try to answer, even though it's a very open general question, is what are your understandings of decentering ELT? What do you understand of the concept? What are your perceptions of it? So with that question in mind, I'm just going to give the floor first to Gracia, since you were the first time who arrived. Let me start with you, since you've been here for the longest period of time. I hope you are okay with that. Gracia, is that okay? And
Yes.
so let's start with you, Gracia, and then we will continue with the rest.
Thank you, Paula. And thank you, Richard Amal, for the opportunity to be here and share about our context, and especially to share our perspectives on Decentring ELT. And thank you to the whole organizing team for having us today. So today I want to share the perspective of our region and my context in particularly regarding Decentring ELT and what this looks like and how this view can contribute to the research that has been conducted. And I want to bring two perspectives into this discussion that I think and consider are important. And one has to do with access. And when I talk about access, I'm not only considering materials or resources or training or information that is contextually adapted, but I'm talking about the access that teachers can have to improving their own proficiency, to access comprehensive ongoing professional development. And the reason I'm saying this is that in our context, the context where we work, we have a great divide in how language professionals access quality professional development and training. For example, we have a great divide between public school teachers and private school teachers in the way that they are accessing materials or even grasping the potential of adapting these materials to their own context and needs. The access in the public school system for our country and for teachers to have ongoing professional development is limited. They don't have opportunities to enhance their own proficiency skills. And most of the times, public school teachers in our context, and this is the case for Central America and Latin America as well, are sent to the English classroom without having enough proficiency, without being prepared for that context, and they're not provided the training either. So when we are thinking about how do we localize materials, resources, and training, we need to think about also the way that they are accessing possibilities of certification or enhancing their own qualifications. And we have these public school teachers that annually, they have to provide proof that they are being certified or that they are being accessing professional development, but they're not getting the access. And then we have the private school teachers who have access to comprehensive professional development. They have access to a lot of resources. They have access to improving their own linguistic proficiency. They have access to communities of practice. And just recently, as I was reading and preparing for this session, I was reading about a world ranking for EF English Proficiency Index. And they were stating that Honduras is in the top 10 countries where the best English is spoken in Latin America, along with Argentina and some countries in South America. And I'm pretty sure that in evaluating the levels of English, the adults that were evaluated came from private bilingual schools. And that was the source of their information. So, however, and if you think about this, it's not providing the real context of what's happening in the country or in the region, because only a small proportion of learners of English go to bilingual schools. We have 23,000 public schools. We only have around 1,000 private bilingual or monolingual schools where there's access to English. So the ranking does not describe the reality of what is happening, but this report emphasizes one thing that I think is relevant to this conversation, and it's the fact that learning English enables professionals to have access to a variety of opportunities, and that it levels the playing field. And then my question is, how can the playing field be leveled if everyone doesn't have access? And then thinking about the access that teachers have to all the needed professional development, resources, then how does this impact the learners? And that's the second perspective that I want to bring into the discussion. Because if teachers don't have the access, if teachers don't have the resources, that's going to create a huge impact in the language classroom. And we're going to continue to have that gap between learners who attend public schools and those who attend private schools. And generation after generation, this will continue to result into lack of opportunities. It means that we could very well localize, bring the national identity to materials, resources, and practice. We can empower the local expertise in a variety of ways. But if our teachers don't have the opportunities, 100%, our language teachers don't have all of them the opportunity to access these materials, then we're going to continue preventing the equity and inclusion that we are searching in this process. So that's the first thoughts that come to mind.
Thank you, Gracia. Thank you very much for an interesting take on decentering. I'm taking notes just to keep record of different points that the different panelists are raising. So thank you for that. We are going to continue now with our second panelist. Prem has joined us. He's a good friend of the Hornby family. So Prem, I would like to give you some time also to provide your perspective on Decentring ELT. Thank you, Prem.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, everyone. I think it's a very difficult question to respond, actually. And my experience is basically based on my work as teacher, educator, and researchers in one of the periphery contexts of ELT. So that's Nepal. So I think when you talk about decentering, I think it means many things for many people. And we don't really have to agree on our ideas. And if we really kind of think of having consensus of what it is, then again, it's not decentering. Actually, maybe we are more focused on centering and looking into solutions. So that's why decentering in ELT or decentering of ELT for me is basically questioning what we have been actually doing for long in different parts of the world, right? So the questioning basically begins with what is the center of ELT, or what is the center in ELT? Where is the center, or is the center actually fixed? So for me, it is not just like a fixed geographical location. Rather, it is very dynamic and socio-culturally constructed space of people where we are actually connected in and by ELT, for example. So including English language teachers in schools, university professors, or researchers, or parents, right? So there are multiple centers for me. So, these centers are actually, these centers exist in peripheries as well. For example, universities as a center of English language teaching, language schools as a center of English language teaching, or even teacher associations could be at the center of language ELT, for example, as we are discussing now. So decentering in this sense is a concept, or it's kind of maybe an overarching concept that helps us understand a very kind of dialectic relationship between the center and the periphery. And basically, for me, it really engages us in negotiating and repositioning our own values and skills in relation to the context where we work. So basically, it's like questioning, and for me, so the basic questioning lies in ELT. So what basically lies at the center of decentering ELT is I think so. What actually ELT is and how it should be implemented is it's a kind of main question for me. So, for example, some useful questions in addition to what I have raised before could be, is ELT about learning English that is used in the centers? I'm talking about the language, English language, used in the center. For example, as we have read in practice like USA, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, or should be more than that, right? Or should our approaches be monolingual or multilingual, right? These questions are not really value neutral. So they are very much like value-based and ideological. And these questions are not actually new indeed. And there are different scholars like Kachru, we are familiar with his contribution in ELT, Kumarabada Velu, Suresh Kanagaraja, particularly in this Indian subcontinent, have long been questioning this kind of like center-based approaches in ELT and the ideas of world Englishes, for example, post-method pedagogies, and the integration of local knowledges and cultures provide a very different, I think, very powerful decentering perspectives in English language teaching. So what I'm basically asking here or raising, I think rather than responding to your question, Paula, what I'm basically asking is, what actually lies at the center of ELT? So that should be basically questioned, and then maybe we need more kind of diversification of our understanding about ELT by basically looking into, not just recognizing, but looking into the relevance of the knowledges and practices that are actually have been part of kind of English language teaching for long, as I gave examples. For example, local knowledges or culture, or the use of different varieties of Englishes in different parts of the world, even the locally produced materials and all those things. So I think decentering for, the decentering project, first, I think should begin. Again, we don't need to agree on this, but we need to ask ourselves, or we need to really raise the question of the relevance of monolingual ELT that actually dominates our perspectives about ELT. For example, ELT material production, ELT teaching methods, ELT research, and all those things, even teacher development, right? So I think we need to look into the recent development in the multilingual Tron in TESOLs or ELT that offers very alternative, very powerful and relevant alternative decentering insights in ELT. So I think I will stop, Paula, here, and then if you have any questions, so maybe we'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Prem. Sorry, let me pause my timer. Everybody has been very good and on time. Spot on. Thank you. Thank you, Prem, very much. That was very interesting. There are definitely a lot that we could discuss from both perspectives because they are different, and that is why the discussion could be so rich. They're very different perspectives, and that is probably what we were looking for in this discussion. So I'm going to continue now with Eric. So I'm going to leave the room for you to share your views, your understandings of decentering ELT.
Okay, thank you very much, Paula. Co-panelist, I'm very honored to be here this afternoon. I have been trying to look at the various components of decentering ELT. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that for us to understand the decentering practice, there is a possibility of us trying to understand where the center margin ends. That's where we start looking at decentering. When Palmer traveled to Asia and discovered that the process of learning English out there are not consistent with what he had experienced in the UK, that was an indicator that there is something in the periphery which is not in the center. And what I understand is that what we are doing now is trying to understand that ideology of local practices that link with local experience. So I'll be trying to look at whether this is something very realistic. From this, we understand that decentering itself, what we're doing now, we're trying to understand the practice. It's something that has been going on, and there's a lot of it that is going on out there, which we have just limited data or insufficient information, which can help us capture the whole scope of the ideology. If you look at the case studies that we have already, there is a possibility for us to generate the idea that decentering in one way is a form of critical pedagogy. Why do I think it's a form of critical pedagogy? This is a strategy that is used to be locally relevant and in ways that do not necessarily match with the kind of training practitioners have received or the kind of ideology which is prevalent in the context. And what that also means is that the dynamics of the local context define how decentering fares. If we understand this, there is a possibility for us to also hypothesize that decentering is widely diversified. If we have to understand the practice of decentering, we are just at the beginning because it's just going to be highly diversified. The local practices, the local dynamics are never going to be common. They're never going to be common. So they determine if they have a determinant effect on practice, then these factors are far from common. Now, what we should be trying to understand is what is it that cuts across the different contexts which we can draw as a starting point for hypothesizing, or let me say, understanding the line in decentering. This is the other factor. When I get back to the case studies, I realize that what we are trying to do now is to knowledge what has been happening. The studies the study reported by Apiba, Klaas, and from Nepal and other countries, these are things that are being done by practitioners. But there's one thing which we need to bring to the table. Most of these case studies have not yet given us an impact assessment. And a fair impact assessment can be obtained from learner achievement. So we must also, I think it will make sense for us to try to get into what kind of achievement is made from decentering practices, to be able to settle on what potentially holds as a main ideology in decentering. What we understand in the periphery is that teacher training practically follows orientation from the center. Why? Because most of the trainers, it's either they were trained by Eurocentric or the center, from a center perspective, and they're transmitting this to teachers. But what is happening, what the teachers are doing, they are not trying to counteract what they were trained to do, but at the same time, they are not implementing what they were trained to do exclusively, but they're trying to find their own way of doing it in a way that can lead to success. So there is a kind of trying to find your way by not accepting what you have been asked to do and trying to achieve maximum effect in what you are doing. That to me makes a lot of sense if we have to understand decentering. This equally means that if we have to assess the value of decentering, then we must also have to find a way of checking how these practices reorientate training, the kind of training which teachers get from training colleges. That, in a way, will be expanding the scope of decentering and trying to see how the trainers themselves can generate ideologies and practices that run from training to practice and which have an impact on what learners are capable of doing. Now, that is, to me, it seems to me as though we would need to find a way to document the different decentering practices which are hidden. I remember in one of our Camelta conferences, one of our guest speakers said, teachers have written tons of books on the chalkboard and have erased them at the end of the day, and nobody knows this. This is Eric Dwyer from Florida University. And I have this impression that if we don't find a way of documenting these practices, we are just starting decentering. Because there is a whole lot of it that we need to put together and then look at study the data and try to knowledge it and find a way that we can be able to define what decentering in itself means. Lastly, Paula, when I got this concept, decentering, in a meeting in Liverpool, I started thinking that this could be a methodology. But when I look at the case studies and then I work with teachers in Cameroon and I see how teachers are generating knowledge to overcome challenges, and not knowledge because they've been taught to do it. I realized that it's far from being a methodology. We can't qualify it as a methodology. I started thinking whether it could be an approach. But when you look at the limits of an approach, when you look at the definition of approach, in ELT approach, you realize that decentering extends the ideological orientation of ELT approach or ELT teaching approaches, because it doesn't actually fit in a particular space. And it doesn't actually tell the teacher that when you're going to class, go and decenter. It doesn't. Now, the teacher gets to the classroom and finds himself in a situation in which he thinks that, well, the best way to solve this problem is to make it work. And if it works, then I go home with something that in itself is decentering. So I want to stop here for the moment and maybe come back if you create the space for me again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric, for that. We have lost Hasna. I hope she can join us again soon, or she's there, but I cannot see her fully on screen now. I don't know if anybody in the team could help me make her a panelist. Are you as a panelist, Hasna? Yes, you are there. Thank you very much. So I'm going to continue now with Shresh, and then I will move on with you, Hasna. Is that okay? So Shresh, if you could use your time to share your views about ELT. You are muted still. There you go.
Okay, am I audible now, please?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Thank you, Paula, and thanks to colleagues and my greetings. This is a very pleasantly cold evening in North Bihar near Indo-Nepal border. And allow me to go a little bit personal. Today I taught at the school where I teach, and I had 38 children, about 25 girls, 12 or 13 boys. all between 8 and 12-year-old. Close to 80% of them, and by now they are expected to be fluent readers of books done by government textbook committees, but close to 80% of them cannot read a word, cannot write their own or their parents' names using letters of the Roman alphabet. And we must acknowledge that in India today, let alone the world, in India today, we have hardly a future without adequate proficiency in English. English is no longer a British language in India. It's another Indian language. More than 220 million people have claimed it is their preferred second language, which means it overtakes Hindi. All business, all jobs, even marriages are made keeping in mind whether the bride and the groom are proficient in English. Some colleague just now raised the question of access. So the problem is, how do we create access for these 38 children? And this is where I like to come and say what decentering means to us in this village, in one of the most backward areas of the world. Decentering here to us means finding a local solution to a global problem. The problem is the same, learning a non-native language. But we will have to find a local solution. How do we create access? How do we sustain motivation? How do we create adequate exposure? And what kind of curriculum such that can be implemented using local resources, using untrained teachers? Just now, my good colleague Eric talked about teacher training. What kind of teacher education? Unfortunately, we don't create trained teachers. We create trained workers. They are good only at delivering a given syllabus. But we'll have to innovate. We'll have to be imaginative enough to find local solutions to global problems. We'll have to see what our untrained teachers, how little of training can be adequate for them. India, unfortunately, still follows the British days practice of producing a trained graduate teacher in 2 years. That's a luxury India can no longer afford. It has over 330 million school students in government schools alone waiting to learn English, and trained teacher output is under 30,000. Just imagine the kind of staggering problem that confronts India. The only way we can do it is by decentering, finding our own local solution. Let's meet again and again. All of us may not know, may not be equally fluent or proficient in the English language. But if you know about 500 words, if there is a lady here in the village, if there is a retired worker, a bank clerk in the village who knows about 2,000 words in English, then we can invite that teacher and ask that teacher to share those words, share that knowledge. Luckily, Paula, we in India have a rich tradition of finding local solutions. You must remember when the British arrived here in the 17th century, nobody knew English. When they got power in the mid-18th century, nobody knew English. But by the end of the 18th century, they had started, creating glossaries, word lists. They experimented with translation of Indian accents into English. They found, some of these direct methods and indirect methods began in India. Alexander Duff was a priest, a Christian priest in Calcutta, who began direct method. He would draw a fish on the board and ask his students, Bengali-speaking students, put a pencil upon the eye of the fish and would ask what that was. And the students would say Bangla word for eyes, and he would give eyes. Come to South, Madras, Bell's method, monitor model. Senior students can teach their younger friends. So today in India, we need to invent and use all of these things: grammar translation, monitor, senior students helping undergrad, their younger friends. What we also must at the same time remember, India has some of the best learners of English. You talked about British Council and my experience in examinations with them. I have some access to those data. We have in Indian students have the highest average in writing in the writing module of the IELTS, but they don't have a similar band in speaking. And that is primarily because we don't speak English the way rest of the world in the standard varieties, elsewhere do. How can we do that? Now, we cannot create another Englishman or woman here. So then, we think of Michael West and what is minimum essential. What is it we must teach? Michael West was an English teacher in the Bengal of early 20th century. And incidentally, he got the first DPhil in ELT at Oxford. So, one of those things, what is the basic reading list? What is the basic word list? What is simplified reader? What is it that must be learned so that we stay local, but we are globally understood? Like, I can understand Eric and Paula, you and Prem and other friends, and can expect to be understood. So then when we asked ourselves these questions, we found that there wasn't much, and it was doable. If we taught them how to stress a word, maybe speak a little bit slowly, keep the order of words all right, then, we have done it. Everybody can then speak and be understood. Everybody can acquire fluency and confidence. All we need by way of external support is a pat on the back, saying, okay, you are doing all right. And as the British say, the proof of pudding is in eating. We have had considerable amount of success following these local, traditions of global problems. So to wind up, let me come back. I see decentering as finding your own sustainable, locally viable solutions. Why emphasize learning of sentences? Overemphasize. Why must we be correct only grammatically and not morphologically, not lexically? Let's first create a vocabulary of 1,500 words, which is not easy. Just bisyllabic words, frequently occurring. 50% of them can be nouns, 30% can be verbs, remaining 20% can include adverbs, adjectives, articles, pronouns, etc., etc. Let there be a predominance of bisyllabic and monosyllabic words. Trisyllabic and polysyllabic words can follow. And within those 1,500 words, we can give enough confidence. And there are websites, there are dictionaries which tell you which are those 3,000 words that are used most frequently and must be learned First, enough dictionaries. All we need to do is to have the courage to implement it and to tell the governments, sorry, you are no longer realistic. Please allow me to go my way. But governments, Paula, please believe me, worldwide, maybe your country is different. Governments are huge hurdles to anything good, including learning. Please pardon me, at my age, I think I perhaps have become a cynic, but I see this alone as the way. Thank you. If you have any questions, I will try to answer, but I'm not too sure if I can answer all questions.
Thank you, Shresh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shresh. Thank you for that interesting, for sharing your interesting views, perspectives on this. We're going to possibly come back to some of the issues being raised here. I don't know if Amol, you're able to pick up some of the questions, some of the comments that are coming from the chat. We can talk about that later after we finish with our last but not least, Hasna is here with us. So Hasna, I'm going to give you some minutes for you to share your understandings of Decentring ELT.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. At the beginning, Decentring ELT is a concept that is new here in Gaza, specifically in Gaza specifically, or in Palestine in general. And at the beginning, I have a very difficult point of view to understand what's the meaning of the definition and what do we need by that, because we usually faced by two things. The first thing that we usually ask, especially in Gaza, so why do we learn English as long as we will never leave Gaza because of the political situation? So students are not able to speak, or they are not even interested in learning English itself, because we will not be able to leave Gaza because of the border, because of the blockade, because of the siege, and that makes them learn so little or not even interested, in addition to many difficulties that we live here in Gaza. The other thing that made me think about it, that we usually have a lot of courses about teaching teachers and educating teachers about the best ways of learning, teaching English. And usually these best ways of teaching English is global ways. So the aim of them to help teachers to face the challenges, the obstacles that they have, to adapt their classes, to use these like global education techniques. But unfortunately, most of these courses that we talk about adapting and elaborating and being better teaching by using all these global or centering teaching methods have become a burden on both teachers and the students, because teachers have to try all of them, and it's not working on the Palestinian classes because we have many difficulties. The first one is that we have overcrowded, and these overcrowded classes, which exceed to 50 students in the class, and having 2 shifts, morning and afternoon shifts. And after the last aggression, we have 3 shifts. So you have limited time, you don't have time to do all these. And most of them are not successful in our classes, as I said, such as, for example, anything related to critical thinking, because it is a cultural thing, not to critique people or not to criticize people. So I couldn't understand or to give the definition for decentering ELT without having the political and the social and the economic background. So for me, decentering ELT is the process of teaching English as a second language, with the understanding the minimum resources that we have, and acknowledging the impact of the political circumstances such as wars, aggressions, and in addition to that, the impact of economic and social difficulties such as female minors, marriages, and poverty. And all that, in addition to that, the students try to put and channel all their experiences and expertise in teaching English and finding and forming the best and the most effective ways in teaching English in a very sustainable way. And I found that we have something, unfortunately, is that sometimes we shame teachers who are not able to use these global techniques. Sometimes when we have we have visit exchange between schools or between other teachers, and they the teacher will explain. It's more about the techniques that he used or how many techniques he used in these classes, even if he's not successful in their classes. So for me, Decentring ELT has different maybe concepts than others, but it is about making more students able to think that English is not hard as they think. It's about that it is not necessary you must learn English because you need to leave your country or you can travel your country. Also for me, Decentring ELT is advanced and it needs more how can I say it, more thinking and more explaining to understand because it is different from one country to another country. I understand most of what they talked about having, for example, differences between teachers from public schools and teachers from private schools. Here in Gaza, we don't have that because most of English teachers are having a positive attitude towards teaching English. And they have all the resources that they have, but also it is limited in one way or another. It is related to internet. It is related to how people see it. And as I said, as long as you use more global techniques, you are a better teacher. You are not able to use these techniques. You should work more on yourself, and you have to work more harder. So that's my point of view.
Thank you, Hasna. Thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting take on what decentring means to you. We have had a very interesting set of points being raised here by all the members of the panel. So I now would like to just give you a few of extra minutes. We don't have that much time, unfortunately, but just about 5 minutes to open the floor to any of you. You can let me know if you, Prem, Eric, Gracia, Hasna, or Shresh would like to add something based on the different views shared by fellow panelists. So if anything that they say just triggers some thought or may make you express something else, just let me know. Prem, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I just wanted to highlight what I have actually missed in my talk before. So this whole notion of teacher training actually is in many ways for me is dehumanizing, particularly in the context of periphery. So we often treat teachers as trainable subjects, like the animals who are ready to be kind of trained, right? So and what happens is basically we expect that teachers coming to us, basically means who are kind of like in higher education, universities, or plus maybe kind of like coming from different contexts, right? So then these teachers are trained, but we don't basically understand where they come from and what are their values, what are their sociocultural realities and contexts. So, and then what happens is we expect them to try these things, right? Try out these things, what we tell them to apply in their school, but that does not really work. So this whole notion of teacher training as something that, that addresses, the problems or issues as we have discussed here in different contexts is something really problematic. And I'm not saying just the models of teacher training now, but the whole notion of teacher training or training as such is actually not recognizing teachers' struggles and their agencies, values, ideologies, or in many ways very effective knowledge and skills in different parts of the world, in the periphery, for example. So I think one of the key areas of decentring ELTs would be, I think maybe we need to really question what we have been doing in the broader rubrics of teacher training or teacher training schools or teacher training organizations, and how actually we are positioning teachers and what do we expect from them. So basically, I think that is what I wanted to raise questions here. So how do we basically recognize teachers' agencies, knowledge, and skills they actually have built by teaching for long, as Suresh has just highlighted, in different difficult situations. So, but at the same time, it's not just recognition of what these teachers are doing in local context or difficult circumstances, but also redistribution of their knowledge, right? As legitimate knowledge and skills in teaching English in other contexts as well. So both recognition and redistribution of knowledge is really important. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, Prem. Thank you for that additional reflection on an important topic. Anybody would like to add anything? Gracia, go ahead.
Can I Paula?
Sure. Okay, Gracia and then Shresh.
Yeah, but Gracia first, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. So something that resonated with me from what Trish and Hasna were mentioning is that as we embark in this process of decentering ELT, we need to be aware of all of the aspects and not only the focus on materials and training, but be aware of all the aspects, all the contexts, all the needs and the realities of each classroom, of each local context. Understand the who, the how, the what, right? We're going to embark in that process of decentering ELT in the different places, those perspectives that we need to keep in mind. And thinking about what Shresh was saying regarding access or exposure, right? Those are things that come into play into this process. Also, in reading the comments in the chat, I can see how important it becomes to understand the nuances of each context and address decentering ELT based on those particular characteristics and situations, because we cannot come again and follow the same trend of having a standardized approach to decentering ELT. So I think that's why this conversation is really important, because we are looking at all the perspectives. We're not coming with one definition that really drives what we're doing, but we're thinking about how can we use all those perspectives to bring that local perspective into the game.
Thank you, Gracia. Thank you very much for that. Shresh, would you like to continue?
Right. Pardon me, I don't quite agree with Prem. When we say, it can be a very distorted view of training to think that imparting training is something subhuman or dehumanizing. I don't think so. Training, so long as we recognize that teaching is not always a biologically natural activity of human beings. There is some kind of skill, there is some kind of process and product involved. Then it is always useful that we learn from the experience of our ancestors. The problem with teacher training is not that there is quote unquote something called training. Training also has a larger connotation. How do we learn riding a bicycle unless somebody runs behind you, unless somebody helps you mount the saddle? Okay. So in that sense, we have to train in a larger sense our teachers to think, to create their own resources out of nothing, to create their own materials out of local knowledge, using a global language. You cannot have both as strangers. Language and content, they both need not be strange. You can have the same content in the new language. You can have the new content in the same language. But if we train our teachers adequately, or if we educate them, sensitize them, use the word you are most comfortable with, if we create a fraternity of colleagues who can innovate, who understand the local problems, whose competence, whose minimum competence in the language they are going to teach at least is of a certain level. And if that is not, then we can help them as well, or we can train them to train themselves. In that sense, training definitely is desirable, and we must strive to create a culture where people train themselves to innovate according to situation. Then there are local specific problems. As I told you, the problem of global intelligibility of our local pronunciations. Now, should we change everything? The teacher, therefore, a sensitive teacher, therefore, would know how much must change so that a colleague in Gaza, or a colleague in Nepal, or a colleague in Latin America must understand somebody from a village in India. So that sensitivity is required there, and that by that I mean the target is global. We can no longer afford to be, no matter which country, where we come from, we are no longer isolated pockets. It's a matter of time when labeling, country levels like now would become just cultural levels. The technology has almost wiped out local boundaries. So the goal is global. We all have to understand one another. And it so happens by accident of history that just now this language is English. It used to be French. It used to be before that Persian and Turkish. Turkish was the maritime language, even in Asia. No matter Portuguese or British, they had to learn Turkish to sail on Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and also to a large extent on other oceans. Today it happens to be English. Tomorrow it will be something else, maybe Chinese, maybe Hindi, maybe Spanish. But the problem would remain. And for that, and we must prepare, perhaps training is not a good word. Maybe we also train dogs to, pick up our tennis balls and bring them back to us. So let's use another word. Let's say educate. We may need to educate our teachers such that they adequately understand the local problem. They are capable of finding and delivering solutions. That, in my opinion, will be the right understanding of decentring.
Thank you, Shresh. Thank you. Sorry, I would like to leave a few minutes. I know that we are a bit over time, Debbie and Amo, but I would like to give 5 minutes at least for Eric and Hasna to be able to express themselves, and then just use our last 10 minutes or so to look at either questions or comments and then some final remarks. Okay, if that's okay with you. So would you like to use some of that time, Eric?
Yeah, sure. I can just cue up from what Shreesh is saying about teachers, trainers who must have skills to train, to be able to teach in teacher training colleges. One of the key problems with teacher training is that it centers the teacher. It makes the teacher the center. That is a key problem. So it is a way of finding. We have to find a way of getting a process of training that decenters the teacher instead of centering him in the classroom. And what happens is that when the teachers get to the classroom, and the kind of training generally, what is common is a craft model in many parts of the periphery, the craft model of training. And what happens is when these teachers get to the field and they confront the monster learning a language or another language, now they start producing or generating practices which unconsciously are revolutionary in scope and dimension. And then at a certain point, you find these same teachers telling you there is a marked difference between training and practice, because the context of practice is unreal in training. Now, what this tells us is that decentering is an idea generated by an individual with the interest of finding satisfaction or finding a solution or having an achievement in what they're doing. Now, in this process, I read Harry's comment that we have not talked about teacher research, and I think it's very important we talk about this. Teacher research to me is a process of decentering. It's not. We can claim that it is itself, well, from my view, a decentering process, an aspect of decentering, rather the process through which teachers emancipate themselves from the kind of center ideologies which training has implanted in them. Now, this tells us that decentering at a certain point, if we look at it keenly, is kind of negative feedback to training. Unless we are claiming that the teacher training schools are developing a bank of processes and methodologies based on classroom feedback. And if this is not yet the point, then I think that teacher training is a center, and finding local solutions to local problems, probably through teacher research, can be the dissenter.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Well, Eric, I agree with you on that point. So Hasna, could we just go with you on your final words?
I would like to thank you for this opportunity. The first time we talked about decentering, I went to my school and I sat with my English teachers colleagues, and they started like, okay, tell me, what do you think about decentering? And we started collecting information from each other. The next day, they came to me with having totally different ideas about decentering, and we started discussing it. And we have been like, since 2 weeks ago until now, we have been decentering every day. We have been discussing decentering every day from every point of view, which is always different from the other one. But the main reason that this became something interesting is we weren't aware that there is many aspects of teaching English. We weren't aware that it is not always the global way is the right way to teach. And we actually use local ways, and we use local solutions, and we face our challenges in our classes in a different way. And every teacher has his own way to deal with the obstacles that they face in the classes. But we did not know that this is decentering. We did not know that this is putting your local expertise and your local thoughts about how to deal with these situations. And that's what I like. Then when we have such discussions, our point of views will be wider and wider, and we can reflect that to our colleagues, our students. And I'm thinking that now I will go and I'll say, like, we have different points of view. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and we have like the whole world is here, and we can collect information from the whole world. So that's what I'm really I'm really delighted to have this conversation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Hasna. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to leave the floor to Amol, who is also a chair of this panel, and to see whether you would like to mention any questions that has been raised or any comments that we have received from the chat box or through Facebook. So I leave the floor to you, Amol.
Yep. Thank you, Paula. And let me confess right in the beginning that it's literally impossible for me and probably for many of us to keep track of the massive amount of discussion that's going on in the chat box. How I wish we were all in Delhi in one place as originally planned and in the same room. It would have been such a rich and fantastic exchange. And I also apologize in advance that I'm bound to miss quite a few things because it has been such rich, diverse, and so many parallel strands going on in the discussion. But what I noticed as a kind of common trend or common concerns featuring across all kinds of discussions are two things. That's my personal view. One is a feeling that if we want to deepen our understanding of decentering, we also need to look at notions of the center and have a complex, nuanced understanding of the center. Different people have put forth their views or their own perspectives on the center, including the panelists. For example, how Prem talked about multiple centers, and that has echoed in the postings of different people as well. And it's not a very easy way, and there can't be one exhaustive definition that will adequately explain the notion of center in all contexts. But from the Facebook chat, there is an interesting hint which might take us to a more nuanced understanding of center. The phrase that discriminatory nature or practices. So if we are talking of the center and the decentering practices, if we are talking of questions of access or irrelevance of solutions coming from other places, we are essentially going to the roots of some kind of discrimination happening there. So probably that might be one hint or one clue towards a deeper understanding of the center and decentering. Another word or notion that figured in several posts in the chat is the notion of the local, not necessarily the same word everywhere, but that the notion of the local. And once again, it seems that the general sense is local is something that cannot be defined universally applicable to all contexts everywhere. And I particularly liked the kind of link Professor Shirish Chowdhury made between the local and the global, and many people picked on that, even on the Facebook, that local and global are kind of integrally connected to each other. And while looking at one, we should not lose sight of the other, which is in a way a productive decentering way of looking at our reality. In terms of questions, there are 2 or 3 questions which I could pick up, and those questions were common to a couple of people, so I'm not taking anybody's name. But one question is about, let me quickly check, I have noted it here. One question is about checking the impact of decentering initiatives or what gains the case studies presented yesterday led to, or what kind of things have been achieved out of those things. The question is, if we are asking such kind of impact assessment, then isn't it fair to ask in the first place, what has been the impact of the current centrist practices? And if there hasn't been any fair impact assessment of whatever we have been following so far, why should we wonder about or puzzle about, worry about the impact of decentering practices? And do you think, Paula, we should ask maybe one of the panelists to respond to this? Or
yes,
shall I go
so I think maybe what we should do is you pose a question, and then one of the panelists, the first one that raises their hand to answer the question, and it needs to be answered rather briefly, like a minute or so, so that we allow, because there are 2 more questions that are coming in the chat box, so that we allow for at least 2 or 3 questions to be answered. Would that work?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So
maybe,
the question, Eric, you want to answer that question?
yeah, I want to try something.
That's okay.
Yeah. We aren't going to be talking about trying to understand what is happening as far as decentering is concerned when we don't understand the effect of that decentering process. Then we will spend time hypothesizing. I have the impression that our understanding of decentering right now is to give value to what is happening. And having that impact assessment, to me, is a way of giving value. Let me take, for example, we agree that there is a lot of decentering happening out there, which we don't know. And in structures of hierarchy, in context of hierarchy, most of these practitioners who get engaged in decentering practices do not really feel in themselves that what they're doing is something that can be projected as good practice. And so because of the ways through which their societies have structured their minds, okay, they think, okay, this thing just worked for me. Okay, great. Now, if we don't find a way of getting the same decentering practitioners understand how valuable their practices have been from learner perspective, we would spend a lot of time stealing the show. We would sit in our offices and talk about decentering, and without being able to measure the impact of decentering on the very people who matter in the decentering process. That is my approach to it.
Thank you, Eric. Amo, would you like to raise another question?
Thank you so much. And there are a couple of questions regarding the practice of decentering. And one question is, can any of the panelists give some examples of how a local solution can lead to decentering? Would someone like to respond to that?
Shresh?
You see, there has been an extremely unfortunate impression has been created that it happens with most prestige languages. So therefore, it should not be surprising that there is only one grammar and that it can be done only this way. In a country like India, where no quote-unquote indigenous language is monolithic. You know, Amol and I speak languages in certain regions of our country which themselves have many local varieties, and think of English spread over, spoken by people who learned it before they were born and who have been learning it ever since. There can be multiple varieties. In that sense, you know, we should have encouraged a culture that you are right, you are not wrong, so long as you achieve an XYZ. That XYZ still remains undefined, and vaguely we insist, unless every consonant, unless every vowel is pronounced the way a certain dictionary or a certain professor of a certain university does, that has resulted, not that they have directly said so, but over decades, an impression has been created that only this and nothing else is the right model to learn, which has resulted in very frustrating, disappointing consequences. So first thing we must change. Look at the example of teaching pronunciation. We teach everything all over India. We teach grammar, vocabulary, writing, literature, Shakespeare, Chaucer, today's poet, yesterday's playwright. But we dare not teach pronunciation because lest we should go wrong. Now that's an example, and it's a serious one. Today even Indian companies have become multinational. There are Indian companies which work in dozens of countries. Actually, think of Tata Consultancy, think of Infosys. They have people from over 100 countries. And English is about the only way in which you could interact with customers, with colleagues, with prospective clients. Now, unless we create this culture of, okay, there is this English language, and you must have X and like everyone else, but Y and Z, A, B, C, and D can differ. It's not a shame if I understand that Eric is different from the one in Lancaster or in Shropshire. So that unfortunate emphasis must go. What must come is a clearly defined that this is the minimum required. And if you do that, same thing with the teacher education. Why can't we learn from our own experience? Get together periodically. And, Amol will agree that in certain states of India, they have done that. The teachers get together once a month or once in a quarter, exchange their, consult each other about their problems. And somebody has tried something and it has worked. It has worked in teaching of grammar, in teaching of spelling, in teaching of a variety of things. There is no, even in IELTS, Paula, with your permission, I'm taking a few seconds longer than perhaps you have. Even in IELTS training, I had a flock of over 60 teachers to train, and everyone certificate successfully. Once I told them, coherence and cohesion may sound abstract, but it's a problem of using your pronouns, articles, and prepositions, some adverbs correctly. Check that and you will never go wrong. And we checked that and we never went wrong. 60 out of 60 certificated every year. The problem is the confidence that we need in our own innovations. There it is shaky, unless it has the stamp of the British Council, unless the stamp of Amol, unless somebody in authority says, this is okay, we hesitate, local governments hesitate, local bosses, head of the department hesitates, and it stifles the initiative of a young colleague. That is where I agree with Prem, That allow teacher, teacher is not a paid lorry loader. Teacher is a craftsman. She's creating careers. Let there be some fun in the class. Fun has disappeared from the class because of overemphasis upon centering. Sorry, Paula, I took longer than I intended to.
That's okay. Thank you, Suresh. Amol, do we have time for the last question? Or
one probably one more question there. Yeah, there have been several posts discussing how it's important to recognize teachers' expertise, teachers' abilities, competence, their skills, their knowledge, value that and build on that for arriving solutions. In that sense, is there a suggestion that centering actually leads to de-skilling or reducing the capacities of teachers or taking away from them their competence of thinking on the ground, on their feet, and doing things which they find appropriate and relevant? So is that a kind of feature we would attach to centering?
I don't. I know Suresh and Eric have already shared their opinions, but since Prem was so passionate about training teachers, I don't know if you would have something to say about this.
Yeah. I think there is no, one perfect right answer. The first thing is because the whole notion of teacher, I was just questioning the whole notion of teacher training. The whole epistemology, the history of teacher training in ELT, basically. So for me, maybe it depends on the context, but the way teacher training remains at the center of ELT now, right, is something that actually is not really working for me. Actually, in many ways, dehumanizing. I really use dehumanizing because it's not really recognizing what teachers have been doing, right? What teachers have actually struggled for many reasons. For example, negotiating socio-cultural context, lack of resources, but constantly they are evaluated by someone, or basically the Ministry of Education, and they're people who don't actually understand how teachers are, what is the situation of the teachers actually. So for me, it's a very difficult question, but the way the teacher training is actually conceptualized to ask teachers to do something and then evaluate, just because evaluate in terms of those methodological prescriptions that is invented or constructed, I would say, somewhere by someone, and with an assumption that would work all over the world, is something actually dehumanizing for me, and it's not really diversifying ELT knowledge actually. So in many ways, for me, it contributes to de-skilling of teachers. Again, it depends on how we see things, but my experience actually tells basically it's not really working well.
Thank you very much, Prem. Thank you for that. I'm going to now bring the discussion to a close. Amol, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, it's time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amol, for that. Thank you to all of our panelists. I would like just to say a few words. I just kind of make a very brief, succinct summary with the key lines or messages from different discussion, different things being told here. Amol just made a summary of the different things being said in the chat box and through Facebook. So there are different things that appear to be interesting here. Some of them might have been repeated. I'm sorry about that. So basically, there seems to be, there was some talk about, when we talk about decentering, we need to also talk about not only providing a framework for decentering to exist or to happen, but we were talking about decentering opportunities based on what Gracia mentioned. By the way, I need to say that Gracia had to leave. She had a previous commitment. So from a distance, we would like to appreciate her contribution, but she had another commitment this morning. Morning for us in Latin America. So she talked about providing decentering opportunities. She talked about localizing and empowering localized expertise. You have all mentioned that at some point. So if teachers do not have all opportunities for having access to that knowledge, then we are preventing inclusion and equality. So the decentering views also need to think about equality, equity, inclusion, and providing opportunities. And then there were some questions that Prem raised that were interesting. Is ELT about learning English that is used only at the center, and whether maybe our approaches should be multilingual instead? Something that was also mentioned in some way by Shresh also. And then acknowledging local expertise was mentioned again. Teacher education needs to be decentered as well. So teacher research is seen as a decentering process that could allow teachers to show how they have understood their local practices, so to acknowledge their own understandings of the processes. Local varieties of Englishes should be equally acknowledged, again, something mentioned here as well. They need to change the target they need to change your views of a target view of English to a more global, okay, instead of a single way of looking at English. Looking at decentering as a process of teaching English as a foreign language, with an understanding of the minimum resources that we have as well seems to be important, and acknowledging political and social issues, which is a very important point raised by Hasna. And then also something that Shresh mentioned, and he actually mentioned Amol, and it made me aware of things that I have discussed elsewhere with you at some point in different occasions that we have met, is the importance of, if we see centering EFL as a potential danger of, disregarding local practices, maybe those of us who are considered to be kind of in a power position in terms of having a word or a voice in a respective context, we need to be aware of maybe becoming the center of EFL in our respective contexts, and the possible danger of that. So what we want to avoid is for us to become the center again in our respective contexts. And so, if anything, as a final note, the fact that we have multiple views and multiple perspectives seems to be an asset So the idea of local versus global, you mentioned it as well, was widely expressed. So use local perspectives for global understandings seemed to be a key message. And there's also something that Prem mentioned that I think was also agreed, which is there seems to be this need to standardize and homogenize understandings of English language teaching and different perspectives. And maybe we should need to avoid standardizing and homogenizing our understandings of decentering ELT as well. Just otherwise, we're just going to go back to the same trap. So that is all that I was able to capture from our conversation. Thank you very much for all our panelists. Thank you to all of those who make this discussion possible. Thank you for your time. And I leave you now with Richard, who is going to close this session. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Paula, very much for chairing the session with Amal. Thank you, Amal, as well. Both of you really summarized very well what the contents of that very, very rich and deep discussion, which I think will take us all forward into further reflection on this notion of decentering ELT, and gives us a lot of food for thought indeed. We will have and thank you all very much to the presenters, the panelists, but also to all of you who are listening and taking part so actively in sharing your perspectives in the chat. And in the background, thank you also to Milind, who was reporting from social media into the Zoom meeting. Well, we're having a break now for 15 minutes, and after the break, we're going to have another opportunity to hear from the participants in the conference, when we will be summarizing your responses to the questionnaire that we asked you to fill out yesterday. And we received quite a good number of responses with some interesting ideas relating to decentering ELT from your perspectives. So we very much think that that is another opportunity to open the conference to participation from the audience. So we will be summarizing the questionnaire results and to some extent discussing them 15 minutes from now. Until then, have a break and maybe have some real food, not just food for thought, and a cup of tea or whatever you like to drink in the meantime.
I hope it's going to work.
Hi, Sue.
I think we can start, Harry and Sue, if you like.
Right, over to you, Sue. So you're muted.
Okay, can everybody hear me now?
Yeah.
Good. I think we're ready to go then. So welcome back and welcome to this last main session of the day. And this is where we get to look at and to share the views that you've all sent in the questionnaires that you filled in. And thank you to everybody who did take the time and the trouble to send in the questionnaires. We've had, as Richard said, a good response and from quite a range of different countries. So Harry and I are chairing this session, and we've agreed to organise it a little bit like the last session. So I will introduce the speakers. I'll try and keep us all to time if I can. Harry will be monitoring your responses, so do keep sending them in, and Harry will do a resume at the end. So there were 5 questions in the questionnaire, and we've allocated 1 question to each of the panelists, and they will report back to let you know the views and ideas that have come in. After the report, we'll open up for discussion that particular point, and other panelists will be invited to provide their ideas on this. So if we get started, the first question, which is going to be answered by Richard Kiley, was, does the concept of decentering ELT seem important to you? And if so, why? Or indeed, why not? So over to Richard to answer that one.
Thank you, Sue. Well, the responses on question 1 all agreed on the importance of the notion of decentering ELT, with reasons falling into 3 broad and overlapping categories. And in this summary, I'm just going to mention those categories and how they're represented in the comments. First, classroom practice. The notion of decentering ELT has the potential to improve teaching and learning in classrooms through more contextually appropriate teaching. Now, the key words reflecting this notion include local, situated, context sensitive. But a related point is the relevance of local practices to the preparation of students as global citizens. This was mentioned by a number of people. The second theme is teacher development. This set of reasons that decentering ELT is beneficial for teacher development, and this set of reasons included greater professional effectiveness, as well as personal development concepts such as confidence. Again, confidence was a word in a number of comments. Another way in which decentering is important is it is empowering for teachers and for its tendency to get teachers sharing and working together. And teacher associations and communities of practice are mentioned in that sense. The notion of decentering is represented as something novel and stimulating, which can inspire teachers. Third, in addition to the more professional and practical orientation of themes 1 and 2, decentering ELT has a political, theoretical, critical dimension, which connects teachers with current thinking beyond the classroom. It counters imperialist, colonial-centered teaching in ELT in terms of classroom practice and course book. And the comments reflect a need for a parity of esteem, a form of equality of all users, teachers, and classroom practices. These 3 themes construct the importance of decentering ELT in integrated ways. Classroom practice is improved if teachers are informed, inspired, and empowered, as well as working more collaboratively. The ways in which decentering, as I mentioned in theme 2, contribute to professional development. These, in turn, are close to the benefits to practice from engagement with wider themes in thinking. That is, the more theoretical, political, critical voices. There is little detail in the responses on examples of the kind of teaching facilitated by Decentring ELT. Now, this is perfectly reasonable. There was no request for examples in the questionnaire, but possibly points to a direction in which the initiative can go, where we need to have more description of the practices to fill out the labels I've summarized in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Do any of the other panelists have any comments to make, any responses? Does this perhaps match any of the feedback you've got on the other questions?
Yes, I can make a comment.
Yes.
It's interesting, the first 3 positive impacts that you mentioned, Richard, improving teaching and learning, encouraging teacher development, and empowering teachers. These are 3 frequently mentioned impacts of decentering that were added in my responses too, to question 3.
I wouldn't talk about my question, but it struck me hearing what you're saying, Richard, and also listening to some of the very, very interesting discussion that's gone on, that we can focus on the impact of empowerment, etc. But on the other side, it's we're in an environment which requires decentering, and I think perhaps more focus on why teachers feel disempowered, why teachers, what is disempowering teachers at the moment. These structures of oppression or imposition is something that that we could consider together.
Yes, I think that's going to come up. Well, one of the reasons for that is it will come up in the responses to question 2. I think the whole notion that centres at all levels and the whole way in which centres perceive teachers is one of the factors that's seriously disempowering, in the sense that teachers just aren't encouraged to participate in decision making at any level.
You seem to be.
I think these are really important points, and I think in further investigation with participants, such as those who completed the questionnaire, there is a need for better understanding of the background they are speaking from. There's an echo throughout of serious problems being engaged with, and arguably not much substance in the way Decentring ELT is engaging with those. But it is actually a start. It is something that is opening up an agenda. And I think the structural issues we had in the panel in the previous session provided more specification of what kind of, the depth of the structural issues that teachers face in their work.
Just a puzzle for the panelists in relation to the last comment from Richard. I can't remember who, but someone said at a conference I attended, I think it was an ITFO conference, that as long as governments are responsible for education, there is going to be a power issue always involved. And when we talk about decentering and teacher empowerment, there is something about social injustice. There's an issue of social justice or injustice because of the power dynamics that exist within the education industry, if we may call it that. And there is really no fight justice fight that would succeed without allies in the oppressing camp. And so one of the things that I think needs careful reflection is, yes, teachers are happy with the idea of decentering, and they're engaged in decentering at local levels, but this is not gaining prominence because of the power dynamics in the structures. How can teacher associations, teacher communities of practice help or negotiate alliances with people within those power structures to facilitate the notion itself? And how can we, or the Hornby Trust maybe, support such initiatives more broadly?
Good. Any more comments before we move on? It's an interesting start to the discussion. Should we move then to question 2? And Martin, I think you're reporting back on this. And the question was, do you see English teaching and learning in your working context being influenced by ideas or practices that reflect centering or ELT centres? And if so, can you give an example?
Well, again, like Richard, there was a virtually universal yes from respondents to the question. In turn, the main themes that emerged from the examples were, firstly, Bana ideas rule. This was a quote from Nepal, and the extent to which those ideas influence and affect ELT are very varied in scale, from the fact that India is regarded as an ESL rather than an EFL context, informed by Western theories, meaning that no consideration is given to the different linguistic, ethnic and socioeconomic groups and their actual need for English, and that for many of them it is a foreign language, not a second language, and therefore different curricula and pedagogy is needed. Madagascar, where ideas within national ELT reflect centering, communicative approach, task-based teaching, critical thinking, learner-centeredness. Other places where native speakers continue to be seen as experts. Hasna's context, where teacher evaluation depends on how many foreign techniques a teacher can use in class, regardless of whether they're any value relevant to the learners or appreciated by them. And a note from Pakistan, where no Urdu in classrooms even as a translanguaging tool. So Bana ideas strongly influencing at macro and micro levels. So who are the promoters of these Bana ideas? Harry mentioned just now the education industry. And there were some interesting comments about the influence of centre publishers and exam boards, all from the UK. And pointing out that the ELT publishing industry has to operate at a large scale to make profits. And therefore it can only consider needs at national and global levels, since its customers are actually ministries or large chains of private language schools. It can't afford to worry about local needs, especially in low resource or low income countries. So publishers, in a sense, are producing materials for people whose experiences they don't understand. Also mentioned was the incredible power of centre exam boards, especially Cambridge assessment was mentioned. What are they actually testing? What English varieties? What aspects of English? These promoters of this influence of centre publishers results in centre-produced textbooks promoting centre culture and pronunciation. In Latin America particularly, there was a focus on the importance of teaching British or American accents and cultures. And from the social media in India, there was good old Humpty Dumpty was mentioned, the use of our British nursery rhymes. And in the from the Philippines and Palestine, there was an interesting point made that the lack of connection in materials to learners' own settings affects perceptions of the difficulty of learning English. It always sounds foreign because it isn't actually situated in any way. Then there were the multiple centres that Prem mentioned in the previous discussion on the panels, and the power of local centres that don't value or recognise teachers. And this seemed to be particularly true in South Asia, with teachers in schools and colleges subordinate to centres of power like boards of education, the ministry and school administrations, which ignore teachers' voices. From the social media, that teachers believe they've no role to create anything. They're often suppressed by, inverted commas, professors. And examples of a new national learning platform being introduced where the officials didn't think of asking teachers to contribute to curriculum decisions, or new curricula being introduced without any consultation with teachers. And then there's the influence of centre ideas on what happens in teacher education, which again was a topic widely discussed in the previous panel discussion. But teacher training, influenced by ideas and knowledge from the centre, orients practice in a certain direction, and trainees are sent out with ideas that ELT is based on methods and approaches from the global north, which will then influence experiences of large numbers of learners, and so further promotes centre ideas. That's it.
Well, very rich response there, Martin. Picking up on a lot of the topics that have been discussed earlier, I think.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Does the panel have any views on any of these issues? Amal, yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at Krishna's comment in the chat box and connecting it to what you just shared, Martin, about the responses there. So as a teacher, Krishna says that he thinks that to teachers, every new label, activity or approach appears empowering. For example, use of technology in teaching. And I can remember from my own experience in the last 20 years when communicative language teaching appeared as a label, every teacher joined the bandwagon and started saying that they have become communicative language teachers. It was also a sense that they wanted to believe that they had made some progress or they have acquired the latest in the field and they are slightly at the front of the changes and all those things, whatever reasons. The interesting thing here is when we say Bana ideas rule, where are we putting the blame? Are we putting the blame with the ideas? Or are we blaming the ways they have been implemented? Are we blaming the uncritical acceptance of them? Or are we looking at a combination of all of these and how they come to teachers? And in the responses, it comes up again and again that one of the key concerns teachers have is their voices are never heard in whether ideas are imported or when ideas are implemented or some kind of new change is planned. So I believe there is a very interesting insight for decentering there.
Any views on where we're putting the blame? Richard?
Well, you know, the way that Martin moved from, the responses moved from thinking about Bana, institutions like testing agencies and their dominance around the world and publishers, etc. But then moving to consider local, so-called local centers in the different countries around the world, which have internalized or which reproduce a kind of imposition of particular ideas. This was strongly came in the consultation we did before, which some of you have read in the consultation document, that it's too simplistic to think of decentering in terms of just Bana. Although we have to recognize there is that colonial and kind of neo-colonial history, and which has led to the dominance of such textbooks or testing regimes, if you like, and the profit involved in that. I think we really do need economic and political and sociological critiques, which are more sophisticated than simply laying blame at native speakers or geographical center institutions. We need to look at the neocolonialism, how it operates, and how it operates through local, through different countries' own elites and own academic institutions and elites. So I'll stop there.
Richard, do you want to say? Richard Kiley?
Yes, I was just going to make an observation on what Martin summarized. And actually, examples of decentering, it largely seem to have examples of centering. And I think this is a challenge we have as an initiative, that it's quite difficult to understand how teachers are coping. I think the way the discourse is structured, an awful lot of teachers maybe feel bad about what it is they're doing, or don't feel that confident. There's a need for confidence coming through. And they actually have a critique, and a critique about how they're not supported, how they're directed to be doing impossible things, and not supported, not given professional development, not given adequate resources in terms of class size. We heard a lot about these structural problems in the panel discussion, and I think teachers working with these difficult circumstances are ready to provide the critiques, and these, I think, echo where we all are. But actually, these teachers are coping. These teachers are doing a job. They are supporting students. They're getting some students through exams and what have you. And I think it's an actual research project to try and get through the sense of not being supported, to actually find out what is positive in the practice of these teachers. You know, I think this is my own suspicion, but where teachers talk about sharing and collaborating and working together, that is a kind of an ideal they have. But I suspect they basically hardly have the time to do that. I think they are stretched in so many ways in those difficult circumstances. And I think we need to really search hard for what is positive in their practice, what actually enables them to cope and their students or some students to progress, and then build on that. Otherwise, there's a risk that we are developing the critique and not doing much else.
Yeah, a good point. Should we move on then maybe to question 3, which Deb, I think you're going to report on. And the question was, did anything in the consultation paper or the presentations on day 1 catch your attention or seem particularly relevant to your own context? And if so, why?
Yeah, actually, a lot of things caught people's attention. I'm just going to summarise some of the activities that were mentioned as particularly relevant and some of the reasons why. Many referred to the sharing of success stories or good practice, either orally or in writing. And the reasons mainly related to giving teachers a voice, the positive impact on teaching and learning, and the value of local knowledge or expertise. I'm just going to read out a few examples from that. There are many experienced teachers who don't have, for example, a PhD who could have a voice. And sharing things that work may give teachers confidence to come forward to share what they're good at. There's kind of an implicit thing in there that teachers who don't have a PhD don't have anything to say, which is not true, as we know. Sharing success stories can promote teacher development and keep teachers motivated. I've often come across instances of good practice or innovative practice that motivated other members to try that out. Organising a success story conference will inspire teachers to reflect on their successes. Teachers can learn context-sensitive strategies from their colleagues through success story sharing, rather than relying on, quote, experts. Interestingly, we can shift from focusing on problems and challenges and instead think through what has worked and share this with other colleagues, as Richard was just talking about. Sharing success stories impacts positively on learners and learning. It supports specific teachers' and students' needs. And then there were those who made reference to the teacher research initiatives. And the main point that came across from this was the relevance of local knowledge. The idea that exploratory action research can help teachers to explore their classroom issues and resolve them without relying on prescriptive solutions from experts, which may not fit the local context. Quite a few found the communities of practice examples relevant too. And these were either already involved in developing communities of practice or planning on doing them. There was one interesting case where the plan was to attract more women to participate. There was quite a bit of reference to the development of materials, resources and curriculum, and a few interesting comments leading on from yesterday's discussion in the chat about how to promote local writers and editors and how these may be better served by local publishers rather than large international publishing companies. And there was a suggestion in there that the Hornby Trust Teacher Association Project Awards could provide a model by providing funding and a forum for debate, but not directing how local groups use those funds and direct their own activities. But the question is how to persuade big publishers of the value of supporting this model. They also referred to the example of the secondary curriculum in Guinea-Bissau as a good example of how teachers can create materials based on the needs of their learners. And one respondent was explaining how in their context, the ELT industry hits hard. Private schools ask students to buy expensive materials and public schools work with government-created textbooks that are far from the language learning reality of the students. People also were impressed by the academic writing course. I think that was FAPI, Argentina. They say that teachers do great things in their context, but they can't share them via publication because they haven't been trained to write. And it was also felt that encouraging local speakers rather than international speakers at ELT events would lead to more relevant and realistic takeaway ideas. That was actually taken from the consultation document of one of the cases there. Something else that came out very strongly was the role of teacher associations or teacher collaboration in empowering teachers. I'll just give you a couple of examples. I like the stories about empowering initiatives, especially during the pandemic. The whole idea of teachers coming together to help each other develop material and find solutions to their challenges. This is a positive departure from dependence on government officials or publishers. Teacher associations researching the needs or capabilities of their members. Someone else said that what resonated with me was the way teacher associations are taking very similar approaches to professional development of their members and committing to practices that generate practical and useful knowledge that works for many rather than just a few, something that cannot be said of centre-led initiatives. And just to finish, there were a few interesting comments regarding the understandings of decentering that came out. When I read about Decentring ELT, I realised that when ATA, that's the Teacher Association in Rwanda, initiated communities of practice in 2014, we were decentering ELT without really having this concept in mind. Someone else, what struck me is how much I didn't know about what's been going on outside Europe in the ELT industry. We can learn so much. I think every language teacher should be exposed to the concept of decentering, as it will lead to a breakthrough in language teaching and learning in general. And an issue that was raised, well, it was touched on by Prem earlier in the earlier session regarding multilingualism and approaches to ELT. It was a question, actually, which maybe someone would like to address. How do you address the neglect and peripheralization of home language literacy in Nepal or Congo or elsewhere? This is a serious challenge. If kids find the language they speak outside the school is devalued and many never acquire literacy in it, what impact does that have? The presentations make me say that there is ELT and Centre ELT is a part of it. And finally, I think the response, I'm not sure about what was particularly relevant, is actually a good, valid response. And it's a good reminder that we need time to process everything that we've heard and discussed around the notion of decentering yesterday and today.
Thank you, Deb. That was really an interesting bag of ideas and suggestions there as well. Does anybody want to pick up on any of those? Maybe address the question about home languages or comment on some of the other ideas. Richard?
Well, one way to start is to analyse where that idea, the monolingual idea, came from. Historically, I was very happy to hear Shrish Chowdhury talking quite historically about things, and that there is a dominance of a monolingual principle within what we might call Centre ELT, which has been spread around the world over many years, and this is where we do need to critique the structures that people are exposed to through teacher training. It's a good example, good case of how an idea which is not an idea that came from anywhere except Europe, really, and it very much bound up with colonial ideology, has become spread into teacher training systems around the world, and is still being promoted in different countries. So we should. That's one aspect of it. This critique of the way how we've got to where we are, and what is the situation where we are. But I'd just like to pick up on what Richard was saying. I think that within this initiative, the Decentring ELT initiative, we are very strongly. We're not really doing that very much. We are actually focusing very much on trying to identify cases of interesting practice, and we're not taking a very ideological or sort of academic perspective. Actually, I hope everybody agrees that we've been trying to highlight cases of practice, and that this is the direction. This is what we've been doing, and this, I think, is what we should be doing. And it's good to hear that some of them are inspiring other people. But we have made a kind of identification of certain projects, not to say that these are the projects that the Hornby Trust will or should sponsor, but from projects that are already existing. We've been trying to identify what has been going on that hasn't been advertised, that hasn't been publicized enough, and publicizing them and sharing them in this kind of conference is one step. But it's really depressing, actually, that even though people like Kanagaraja and Kumavadivelu and Holiday and Philipson, etc., were writing about these kinds of needs at an academic level in the 1990s already, we're in the 2020s, but we still have this situation where teachers are disempowered by inappropriate, well, we could say inappropriate ideologies.
But it's good to know that some of them are doing it almost without knowing that they're doing it.
Needs must.
Amol.
Yeah, I'm once again looking at a very interesting post in the chat by Yumna Muhammad Ali, who says, I think decentering is happening now on more individual basis. I mean by individual, not under a big umbrella or supervision. I think that associations and maybe organizations that are interested in English teaching and learning can help in creating stories of success worldwide. Now, when I look at this kind of post and also what responses they was summarizing, it's not actually surprising that individual teachers have been doing some kind of efforts at decentering, because as at a personal level, whenever a good teacher feels a discriminatory or some negative thing happening, as an individual, good teachers always try to do something. But yesterday's case studies presented efforts by teacher associations. And when there are small or large collectives of people trying to do things in that way, it also means that there has been some kind of conscious and purposeful attempt to counter certain practices which are considered to be not negative, not helpful, or to promote something which was seen as more useful, relevant to the local community. So that kind of encouragement seems to come out of those case studies, yesterday's presentations, and I would completely agree with Yumna Mohammed Ali that if such individuals come together in the form of associations or organizations and do it collectively, more systematically, purposefully, in a planned way, I think there would be much brighter and stronger future for Decentring.
Good. So maybe on that positive note, we'll move on to the next question, which I think you're going to deal with, Richard. And this was, have you come across any examples of decentering ideas or activities in your context? And give an example if you have.
Yes, and this relates to, I think, what we've been trying to do, which is, as Yumna points out, trying to highlight or spotlight cases which might be inspiring for others as a first step, at least, and to publicize them. So in that spirit, let me publicize some further examples that people have contributed, and some were similar to what was presented yesterday, particularly about communities of practice, small teacher groups, and groups developing inquiry into their practices. Others were, though, taking us into some new directions, I think, for the future, because we have been focusing very much on teacher associations, but the panel discussion was also taking us into directions we think should be explored, like teacher training, materials development, for example. And also a few were mentioning their own practices, their own teaching practices, and I'll come to that in a minute. So there were a few mentions just of teacher associations which participants feel are engaging in decentering ELT. One was Nile TESOL, Egypt, and one was Camelta. Without giving any specific examples or reasons, but that's good to hear that people feel that their teacher association is supporting this kind of practice. What kind of practice though? Well, there's one mention of decentering within a teacher association itself, and this was mentioned by Deborah as well, that INET trying to bring women practitioners in ELT to the forefront. So we heard a little bit from Joseph yesterday about how our class is trying to democratize the ways of carrying out its governance activities. So this is an interesting topic. A lot of people saying that they recognized the description given by Joseph of communities of practice, and they recognized that kind of practice was going on in their own context, which is interesting, and it's something I've noticed as well, that communities of practice, small teacher groups, here is a quote: teachers regularly meet in their schools to discuss the best ways to deal with the obstacles they face in teaching English and to develop remedial plans. This was a quote from somebody in Palestine, for example, or Rwanda, saying that our teacher association has 10 communities of practice. So we know that in Africa there are several countries engaging in this within the teacher association in devolving, as it were, activity. And somebody mentioned the English teachers clubs in India as another example. It seems to me that these groups of smaller groups of teachers discussing ideas have different names in different places, but are going on in many places. In fact, tags is something being promoted these days, teacher activity groups, or creation of WhatsApp groups for teachers online meeting for sharing pictures, videos, classroom activities and experiences was mentioned. There were some mentions of teacher associations supporting teacher research, supporting practitioner inquiry, like as described by INET, by Krishna about INET, or Nelta Sagun talking about success stories. Nepal, for example, teachers engaged in exploratory action research within Nelta and sharing success stories. Some were involved with the INET teacher research initiatives and praised that as an excellent example of how teachers have collaborated to develop practical solutions. I'll move on to the ideas, other ideas, apart from teacher association ideas. In-service training was mentioned by some. In India, for example, I think district language associations led by teachers are now leading professional development sessions for teachers. Expertise is drawn from teachers. And somebody else mentioned in India, the cluster resource center meetings, which aim to identify the challenges and solutions to classroom problems and follow steps which this person thinks are related to decentering. One person mentioned an interesting course that they themselves run in teacher training, for in-service teacher training, which is a professional development course for teachers which focuses on phonetics and phonology and how we could apply these concepts concerning our students' context. I thought this might relate to ideas of around English and the kind of English that should be promoted locally. Whether that's related to that or not, I'm not quite sure, but that could be related. One other person mentioned something that they would like to see happening, which was when training sessions are going, in-service training sessions, everyone talks about the use of English to make them learn English, make students learn English. But the ground reality, this is in India, is entirely different. In other words, students with many languages, and that nobody talks about in-service training about how to use the mother tongue, how students can use the mother tongue, relating to that comment by Prem in the discussion. Have I got time for just a couple more, Sue?
Yes, you have, Richard, yes.
Okay. Some consideration in initial teacher training, which we haven't really considered very much. For example, at the Teacher Training College in Bambili, Cameroon, we train trainees to develop materials in context. And this could include materials which, in that context, can be used in teaching morals as well, a local kind of concept of what materials are for. Somebody else in Argentina mentioned they are involved in teacher training and they promote activities to decenter textbooks and materials with their trainees. So I have a critical approach, sounds like a critical pedagogy and kind of approach, to analyze materials and promote the use of English as an international language, having the world as context and not attached to hegemonic practices. Moving on to course design and materials design generally. Somebody mentions taking the local curriculum or syllabuses of other courses apart from the EFL English language subject and incorporating topics and themes from other subjects to present the target language, present English. So it's kind of local collaboration with other subject teachers, and that relates to another point made by a teacher in Bulgaria, advocating proactive CLIL, content and language integrated learning, collaborating in schools with teachers of science, geography, civics, history, literature, art, etc. So it's interesting this person is relating the idea of decentering to relating with other school subjects within the education system. Another example from Egypt is that they've developed a project for teaching English for interfaith dialogue in their language center. For them, that's an example of a kind of English course which relates to local issues, important local issues. Materials design projects, somebody with experience in China, they heard what, I think it was, I can't remember who was saying, but the decision to validate, to recognize the value of choral reading, reading aloud, sorry, in teacher research projects. Remembered that there was a materials design project where the local project director was firmly in charge and made sure that the communicative ideas which were coming in from the outside were integrated with local practices, including reading aloud and learning by heart. And that was an excellent example of sort of mixing, negotiating between center ideas and local practices. Finally, several did mention their own teaching practices, which I think I would just summarize as being a kind of autonomy-oriented approach or learner-centered approach. And it's not exactly what we've been talking about, but it's interesting that several teachers interpreted what we were talking about in terms of their own approach to teaching. And I've just sort of raised the idea that actually these things are related. The way we treat our learners is in a not imposing ideas or not imposing on them, but going, starting from where they are coming from, relates to how we do teacher training. Do we base it on what the trainees are bringing from the local context? It relates to materials design. Do we impose ideas, or do we try to developed ideas from the bottom up. So it's not. So they mentioned like developing local clubs for students to talk together, as we've been thinking about English clubs for teachers. So I think I'll stop. I'll end just with a nice quote from two quotes. One was from I think our Gloria, our speaker, actually. That from the Reiselt example, she's saying that decentering can be developed with few resources and a lot of passion. And finally, in the pandemic, this is from another teacher, another participant. In the pandemic, we realized that teachers were very creative and developed an impressive amount of ways to make their children learn, no matter the distance. And this was very much my perception of what's happened in pandemic. That I think we have seen how creative and agentive teachers can be.
Thank you, Richard. Well, again, a lot there. And maybe we've got place. Anybody would like to pick up particularly on any of those many points? Does anybody want to make a comment on that? Or should we just move on to question 5 and then we can draw up any points at the end? So question 5, Amal, you're going to be reporting on this, I think, is would you like to see any decentering ideas or activities happening in your context?
And the overwhelming answer to that is yes. So there were just a couple of people who said they were not sure or not yet was the correct answer in one case. And since the question that they reported on what kind of activities presented during the conference yesterday, people found relevant to their own context. So not surprisingly, when this question asked them what they would like to see in their own context. So there was a lot of overlap in the responses here. So the activities which people mentioned they would like to see happening there in their own context, where things like communities of practice or sharing experiences, for example, in success story conferences, changing teachers' mindset about using mother tongue in the classroom, finding out innovative and alternative activities that empower teachers, or identifying diverse editors and writers of materials and trying to use materials which were entirely produced outside US and Europe. There were a couple of suggestions about decentering the language itself and showing more open-mindedness and acceptability of all non-standard varieties of English, and also valuing the local linguistic practices. Some suggestions also related to teachers participating in research, informing research, and taking charge of research, and also making efforts to disseminate their research. One suggestion related to the government enabling teacher training in helping teachers design their own activities to suit their needs and contexts. In one case, one respondent mentioned the example of student writing as a powerful way of bringing the local knowledge and local relevance into their classroom practices. Another part of this question was asking people why they would feel these activities they would want happening in their own context. And broadly, the reasons quoted were if such activities happened in their context, that could lead to teachers' own empowerment and promote teachers' professional development. And in turn, it will help teachers to promote positive change in their context. And that would also lead to the growth in teachers' confidence. Teachers would have some way of their voices being heard. They would find their own voices. That would open up new content and knowledge, eventually enriching the students and teachers both. There were also some comments suggesting the transformative change that might bring, though the expressions used were sometimes not clear to me. One person said that it will change teaching ideologies. Another person said that it would change teachers' mindset. And one more person said that it will lead to engaged social justice. But there were a few comments which generally pointed out that all these practices happening in their context will broaden the experience and understanding of people and boost the effectiveness and the reach of ELT, as well as enhance their own performance as teachers. Finally, I would like to interest three very interesting comments, which I believe look like caveats for decentering. In one case, the comment said that the person suggested that there needs to be a balance between the local and the central, because they find a tendency in their own context to be too local. And I think it needs to be understood in the context and understood in greater detail. Another comment that seems quite interesting is a suggestion that decentering practices, decentering should be run under certain supervision and conditions. And finally, the third very interesting comment is the complex network of funding required for such initiative needs to be sorted out in clear terms. I personally believe that in those comments, there is also a suggestion that we need to be quite nuanced and careful when we approach both centering and decentering. And there are lots of complicated issues which are not easily resolvable, but need to be addressed in order to ensure that effective decentering is in place. So that's all from my side.
Thank you, Amol. Any comments on any of that? Maybe particularly on the caveats?
What do you think, Amol, that was meant by run under supervision and conditions? Do you have any sense of that?
Not really, because there weren't any more details to hazard any guesses.
Okay.
Interesting.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of Prem's contribution this morning, saying that for him, decentering, it is a continual questioning. And I like that because it could easily, it's a slogan. It could easily become something fixed, couldn't it? But it needs a kind of perpetual movement of questioning and self-questioning. In fact, we have been self-questioning quite a lot about the idea that it could become a kind of dogma, or that it's not what we want to happen, really.
As the centres shift. Maybe time to hand over to my co-chair, Harry. I think you've been monitoring the comments coming in on the chat.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's I think the momentum kind of died down towards the end of the day, because there was a lot of conversation in the first part of the day, and people might have got tired of hitting on the keyboard. But a few things came out anyway. The key idea that decentering needs to be seen from the theoretical, practical, and critical dimensions. And that the central role and the fact that teacher associations and communities of practice can play a very central role in enhancing a decentering perspective or ideology to language education. There was an interesting association of decentering with bottom-up approaches to curriculum and pedagogy, and also the need for practitioners to become drivers of their own professional development. I think this came from South Africa. So the idea that practitioners have to become drivers of their own professional development and appropriate resources, rather than relying on outsider resources which do not address their learners' needs. So there I saw the idea of the teacher who is close to learners and identifying the real needs and addressing them in ways that are appropriate to the local needs of their own students. The notion of empowerment keeps coming. Since yesterday we've seen decentering associated with teacher empowerment and control of teaching and learning resources. But we also had a comment which questioned the notion of empowerment. What actually empowers teachers? Is it anything new? like technology, decentering, teacher research, everything, every new idea seems to be seen as meant to empower teachers. So how can we, or how can decentering actually empower teachers in practical terms? That's something that needs to be explored even further. Decentering was also associated with critical pedagogy and social justice. And it was thought that it needs to examine injustices such as discriminatory access to professional development opportunities, and that we need to question where the truth in ELT actually lies, and how can we better capture and share viable and sustainable local practices. Now, and it was also suggested that the answer to this last question, it was suggested, might be achieved through not just by teachers or practitioners, but by also involving students in the thinking process. And finally, it was noted in the charts that decentering seems to be happening already, and Amol already highlighted that contribution. The fact that it's happening already under the radar, and many individual teachers are taking up initiatives in their classroom to address their student-specific needs in ways that may not be prescribed by the center, the center or the policymakers in those communities, and that there was a need for organizations like teacher associations or communities of practice to create opportunities for sharing stories of success more broadly, so that teachers can learn from each other in a more systematic way. That should be it from the chat box.
I think another question has just come up in the chat box from Krishna, saying he was wondering, does centering de-skill teachers or just condition them to work in particular ways?
Isn't being conditioned to work in particular ways potentially de-skilling?
Interesting point. This is the thing. There's been a debate. A long time ago, I knew of this debate between whether teaching is a science or an art, and I think it's both. So centering, in a sense, could be scientific in a way. Centering in the sense in which teacher training, structured teacher training happens in university colleges of education, could be a kind of the scientific approach to the profession. How much of that inspires the artistry that individual teachers bring into the profession is another question, is something to think carefully about. So I would say yes, centering could, in a sense, be giving teachers skills, but actually at the same time de-skilling them or acting as an impediment to their personal talents and personal skills that they bring to the profession.
I mean, I think teacher education, let's forget about training for a minute, but education generally, or teacher education, it's all about, enabling students to have critical thinking, to become autonomous, to think for themselves, to solve problems, whatever. And I'm just thinking back to my own teacher training. I mean, it isn't that you are just prescribed, you have to teach like this. Teachers can discover how to teach, how their learners learn, if they're sort of encouraged to think in the right ways. And I think that just applies globally. I don't think it's to do with centering or decentering. I think it's just the right approach to education.
Yeah, but unfortunately, that's not the approach that's adopted in many parts of the world. My own teacher education consisted of tips on how to do things well. It consisted of ideas like learner-centered pedagogies, and there was never a teacher-centered or a trainee-centered approach to training teachers. So, and it still happens now that teachers are increasingly asked to be learner-centered, but they are often trained to be learner-centered using very trainer-centered approaches. There are lectures on how to develop interactive practices in their classroom. That's what happens traditionally in many contexts, at least in sub-Saharan Africa that I'm familiar with.
And do they never challenge? Do they never challenge or question what they're being told?
Well, there are also cultural norms that students, because one of the things that we've probably not talked a lot about in this discussion of decentering is the historicity and the cultural links between the cultural links that are around ELT itself. Historically, how has ELT evolved in the global south, for example? It's been very top down, and that has been translated at all levels of governance, even more, and education, and that has informed an educational culture which is very centrist. And the centrality can be at all levels, at political levels, and we've talked about the different centers of education. Now, where children grow up learning never to contest, to dispute what the adult says, and then goes to classrooms and cannot challenge the teacher, and then goes to a university training college where the person with a PhD is the supreme authority, where the professor's word is law, then that causes problems. And so for many teachers in this kind of context, at least for myself, the real meat of teaching is discovered right in the mix, in the field itself, when you start trying all these practices and they're not just working with your students, and you have to start being inventive. And I think that's what one of our colleagues here said. Teachers are already practicing decentering in many ways, because many teachers are employing pragmatic responses to their immediate realities in ways that are not consistent with their initial training. So there is a lot of work to be done at that level itself.
Thank you. I think that's the opening up of a wider, really important conversation. Unfortunately, it's the end of this session, but leaving us with lots to do, I think. So thank you very much to everybody, to all the panelists, and to everybody who took the trouble to send in their ideas, which have really been very interesting and thought-provoking. So thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Amol and to Martin, who are going to give us reflections, I think, on our progress so far and what there might still be to do ahead of us.
Thank you, Sue. We are coming to the very end of this two-day conference, and we would like to spend next few minutes on looking back at these 2 days and reflecting on whatever lessons and insight we learned, and also trying to draw a few indications of the way forward. So in this connection, I would like to ask Martin to share what his reflections have been on the last 2 days.
Thank you, Amol. Well, what a rich feast it's been. I think, firstly, understanding decentering, I think it's become clearer and clearer just how complex it is, and that there's not going to be a single view of what it means. I found Shrish's statement that decentering entails finding local solutions to the global problems of learning a non-native language a very useful overview. And then bearing in mind what Hasna said, remembering that because of socio-economic and political differences in the learning context, local solutions are going to be different. So the local solutions are going to be different. And that this highlights for me that the notion of best practice, which is one that is very familiar in ELT, and products and global ELT products promoted by centres, whether they are national centres or ELT centres in the West, are unlikely actually to help the global problem of learning a non-native language. I think that's really a critical outcome of the decentering, the whole idea of decentering. Best practice is local, best practice is not global, though local varieties may have some global ideas in them as well, of course. And a second thing that's really struck me is just how much of decentering seems to be linked to these ideas of teacher empowerment, teachers' capacity to promote change, teacher voices being heard, and that there is so much. Richard Smith's summary of the questionnaire, Yumna's post, Hasna mentioned previously, there's so much already, and of course the case studies yesterday all show that so much is already happening. But what's happening isn't well known and isn't valued sufficiently. It's unacknowledged and unknown and remains unknown. And the political and sort of hierarchical status quo in so many environments is, I think, at least partly responsible for that. There's the connection between perceptions of teachers and perceptions of what teachers do and the value of what teachers do. Decentering has a part to play in rebalancing that relationship. Thirdly, and this is from my own personal interest, the relationship between decentering and in-service and pre-service teacher education. I think that teachers are being prepared in many places still with the notion of best practice and based on centered methods and approaches. And they're not actually being prepared or encouraged at all. We're not encouraging trainee teachers or in-service teachers to find local solutions or to think about local solutions. There needs to be a really, decentering can contribute to acknowledging from the start that practices suggested are just starting points. They're not end points. And that all teachers need to adapt and innovate according to their context, and that this is a normal, well, this is what's happening anyway, but actually it's not acknowledged as such. It's not acknowledged that this is happening anyway. And that they will need to keep learning, and that communities of practice or practitioner research or exploratory action research sharing together is part of continuing professional development. And I suppose finally, at some point, the notion of impact came up. And I must say, if we worry about the impact of the decentering initiatives so far, with the very, very small investment that has been put into them, surely we should seriously think about the impact of the more centered approach to teaching English over the past 20 or 30 years, with its massive, massive investment, and draw our own conclusions. But I think the impact from the case studies, from the discussions we've had in the past 2 days, the impact of the decentering initiative and decentering practices, which many teachers autonomously are involved in without ever having heard of decentering, is enormously powerful when compared with the relative per pound impact of much of the centered ELT that has been carried out over the last 25 or 30 years. So where do we go from here? Personally, I think it would be interesting to consider how decentering might influence pre and in-service teacher education. But that's my personal reflects my personal interests. And I'm sure, Amod, you've got some more to say.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure your reflections will echo with a lot of us. Most of us have similar takeaways and feelings about this. I'm also looking at this whole conference as a kind of milestone in the journey that began in 2018, when some of us came together as a voluntary group to start looking deeper into this idea. And we began with our initial focus on teacher associations, which ended up some teacher associations coming forward, sharing their practices within the group and also publicly yesterday. And it became immediately clear that, as you correctly said, there is already a lot happening. And when that those things are shared with others, they also come up with their own understandings and practices of decentering. So on the one hand, we have realized lots of aspects, dimensions, and complexities of this notion. But on the other hand, we also seem to have lots of things to look forward to. And I also tend to agree with you that as a way forward, going beyond teacher associations, probably teacher education would be one key area in which we can focus more concentrated efforts to deepen our understanding. I also have just one concern that I think I should mention here, especially looking at the posts on the Facebook and YouTube platforms yesterday and today. I find a hint of perception that whatever was being discussed in the name of decentering was seen by some people as a kind of methodological or pedagogical approach, probably a new theory or framework to be tried in their classrooms. I'll be very happy to be proved wrong. But if there is a little truth in that, then I find it worrisome. So decentering is not new methodology. Decentering is not next in the line of communicative language teaching. It is a practice, it is a belief, it is an approach, it is a philosophy, it is an orientation. And we have to look at it that way. So I look forward to being proven wrong on that count at least. And I also look forward to continued deliberations, action, practices, thinking, and collective strengthening of decentering. And on this point, I think I should invite Richard Smith to join us so that we can now formally close this conference.
Yes, it's time. It's time to say goodbye. After a very, as Martin said, a very rich 6 hours. We seem to have packed a lot into these 6 hours, and we've got a lot of things to think about. All of us, I think, participants and presenters alike. I'm just going to say thank you to all of you who've been at the conference, whether yesterday or today or both days. Thank you very much for being so participative with your comments, and that's very much how we wanted this conference to be. Even though we are faces on a screen, we very much wanted to bring in your perspectives, your voices into the conference, and I hope you feel that we have done that. And for that reason, and because many people have been involved in the conference, we've had a lot of people involved in the conference who I want to thank, and especially the presenters, the panel, the chairs, but also the behind the scenes, almost the organizing committee. And I'm just going to read out the names of the organizing committee to acknowledge them all by name. That's Dario Banegas, Deborah Bullock, Richard Kiley, Harry Kuchar, Susan Menge, Amal Padwad, Paola Rabiedo, and Martin Waddell. And behind the scenes, you haven't seen her, but Debbie Candy has been a fantastic director of this event. And there's been an enormous amount of work going on behind the scenes and in preparation for this event. So thank you so much, Debbie. Also to Nadeem Khan from INET, who's been also behind the scenes, operating social media, etc. Also, you have not seen Milind Mane, but also he's been there, and Krishna Dixit and Padmini Barua and Vivek Joshi. So thanks so much to you for your contributions as well. Thanks very much to from the Hornby Trust perspective to INET and to your university, Amal. And yes, this has been the 60th anniversary conference of the Hornby Trust, but I'm sure you agree we've sort of moved beyond the just considering about the Hornby Trust, and this has been an extremely important event, and we hope to, in some way, spread its impact, its influence by putting a recording of the event up on our website. We'll probably let you all know if we can when that happens. We are interested in getting more people informed about what we've been talking about, but also involved in discussions going forward. So please watch out for opportunities to participate, to get involved in future directions. Over to you, Amal.
So finally, before I close the conference, on behalf of Richard and me, I also would like to thank Caroline Moore, the chair of Hornby Trust, and all the trustees for all their support and personal involvement in conceptualizing and planning this conference. And also to you, Richard. You wouldn't thank yourself, but you have been instrumental in this whole event. And I would also like to let all our participants know that we would like to bring out some kind of report or some kind of further discussion documents out of this conference if possible. So keep watching this space. And we both co-chairs, Richard Smith and I, and on behalf of the Hornby Trust, I declare that this conference is closed now. Thank you, goodbye, and have a nice time.
Recording stopped.